Hi again everybody, it's Kerry Stead, aka Melbourne Games Coach, bringing you some more action from the 2013 Australian Open Chess Championships from Norths in Cammeray in Sydney. This video is going to look at the action from round 7 of the tournament, but before we get there, once again as usual thanking our sponsors Hancock Prospecting, Norths Leagues, Ridges North Sydney, Australian Chess Enterprises and Chess Discount Sales. Round 7 saw the first all-Grandmaster clash on top board, with visiting Grandmaster Igor Kenkin from Germany playing local Grandmaster Zhongwan Zhao. This was somewhat of a theoretical duel to start off with the players starting off with the Grunfeld defence, which has been very popular with the top players so far this tournament. Kenkin played the knight f3 variation, and Zhao followed with the usual c5, again with this idea of putting pressure on d4. Queen d2 to break the pin on the c3 pawn, knight c6, and here Kenkin played rook b1, which given what was to follow was an interesting choice. I'm no expert on Grunfeld theory, but I know obviously rook b1 is an idea in the position to get off the long diagonal. But it just does seem a little unusual that you'd wait for Zhao to play a6 and then put the rook on c1. Seems a bit unusual that you might not just put the rook on c1 immediately, but then again I'm not a Grandmaster in the top 100 in the world. Bishop to g4 to again try and remove one of the defenders of the d4 pawn. So to alleviate some of that pressure, Henkin plays pawn to d5. Zhao pins it to the queen with rook d8. Bishop comes to e2 to protect the knight on f3. Both players castle and Zhao captures on f3. Zhao then goes about trying to exploit the d pawn by playing e6. Kenkin defends on the d file with rook d1. There's an exchange on d5 and then the knight comes to e5. Kenkin then plays pawn to c4, obviously offering a trade of queens. Zhao first exchanges on f3 to weaken the pawn structure around Kenkin's king, and rather than trade queens he decides to retreat his queen to c7. And this is where Kenkin played a tactic which on the surface at least looks like it wins a pawn. Push the pawn to d6, Zhao went to d7 with the queen, and then queen takes c5, and it looks like Kenkin's simply a pawn ahead without Zhao having much play. However here he simply played rook f to e8, obviously looking to try and take control of the e file. Kenkin brought his bishop back to e3, and then after Zhao's queen h3 we can kind of see the point of Zhao's move. Obviously he is threatening queen takes f3 to get the pawn back. But there's also ideas of bishop e5 with threats on the h2 pawn and potential issues with the king. There's also maybe a rook lift idea of rook e5 and rook h5. So just with a quiet looking move, rook e8, Zhao's not actually concerned about being temporarily at least a pawn down. Kenkin decides to stop that bishop e5 idea by playing bishop f4. And just when the game seemed like it's getting interesting, Zhao actually played queen takes f3 and offered a draw, which Kenkin accepted. That left Kenkin obviously still in the lead of the tournament, Zhao not far behind, and somewhat interesting game between the two players, but it would have been also very interesting to see them played out in a game where they were both definitely playing for a win rather than being able to settle for a draw. Next game that we are going to have a look at is the clash between locals IM Max Illingworth and FM Junta Akita. Starts off as a Sicilian defence, and Junta employs a bit of a unusual method of getting into a hedgehog position. He starts with pawn to b6 and then bishop b7 very early. However, the players develop along sort of normal Sicilian type lines until we get the type of structure that I think both players would be happy with. Akita likes these sort of slow manoeuvring games where he can manoeuvre his pieces and somehow get into time trouble and find his way out of time trouble with a perfectly fine position. While Illingworth enjoys obviously a space advantage, although it's not the sort of either the big theoretical duel that Max generally seems to like, but he's definitely someone that plays well with the initiative and with the space advantage. So Illingworth drops his knight back to b3, knight comes to c6, king hides in the corner, bishop e7 to complete development, and queen to e1. This is a bit of a multi-purpose move, maybe coming out to say g3 and helping with a potential kingside attack, or maybe even trying to support maybe an e5 break in the centre. Hiroshita plays h5, which seems a bit unusual given that he's probably not wanting to cast a queenside and probably not even going to cast a kingside after that move. Illingworth calmly just plays rook f3, which is a pretty sensible move and gives him plenty of options for attacking with the rook on the kingside. Kita plays g6 to try and blunt some of those ideas, and Illingworth plays queen e2. Knight jumps into g4, and Illingworth keeps the bishop by retreating it to g1. Pawn to b5 to get some space on the queenside, rook e1, and the favourite move of Junta Akita at the moment, pawn to g5. He actually recently posted on the Fig Jam blog that he and a number of other players like Molten Lai, Andrew Brown and like write for occasionally about the success that he had with pushing his g-pawn in his recent trip to India, where I believe it was something like in the 22 games he played, he actually played either g4 as white or g5 as black on 11 occasions and had a pretty impressive record in those 11 games, possibly even winning all 11, but I could be wrong. However, as Ian Rogers actually said in the commentary at the time, he said, look, we knew, given that it was Junta, that g5 would be played, we just didn't quite think that it would be so soon in the game. So this attack on the king side, or at least what looks like it might be an attack on the king side, Illingworth comes up with a very interesting response. He plays knight d5, offering a piece, or at least temporarily offering a piece, and Junta decides to accept it. So after recapturing on d5, obviously there's some pressure down the e-file with the queen on e2 and the rook behind it on e1, as well as obviously the knight on c6 being threatened. So Junta decides to return the material immediately and play knight e5. Max takes on e5 and Junta recaptures with his g4 knight. Here, Max chooses to ignore the rook that's threatened on f3 and play bishop e4, just holding that d5 pawn. Rather than actually taking the exchange, Junta played queen c4 to try and swap off queens, and Max stopped that with rook d3, again offering the exchange. Junta then followed up with pawn a5, bishop came to b6 for Max, pawn went a4, the knight went up to a5, hitting the queen on c4. This prompted Junta to sacrifice an exchange himself, and then follow up with b4. Obviously there was some hope that he might be able to trap that bishop on a5. However, to stop that, Max played a3, which kills any ideas of trapping the bishop for quite a while. After an exchange on a3, Junta decided that he might as well grab the pawn on d5 while he could. And again, after some exchanges, rook takes a4. And it's this position that you can really see that Junta, although he's used to these types of positions, is really starting to struggle here. The knight on e5, although it is a fantastic piece, can't move because of the pressure on the e-file. Bishop on e7 is blocked in by the g5 and d6 pawns. The centralised queen is good, but the king is still a little unsafe, and the rook on h8 hasn't really got into the game. If you compare that to Max's position, obviously the rook on a4 can swing pretty much anywhere on the fourth rank, as well as potentially controlling a lot of ideas down the a file. The double queen and rook on the e-file are providing pressure down there and keeping the knight on e5, while the bishop can retreat to c3 if need be, or any other sort of square that it wants to where it's useful, and continue to put pressure on that centre that Akita's trying to hold together. Here Akita played h4 to prevent Akita playing h3. Illingworth played h3 himself, and finally, maybe though not the best in the position, Akita castle. Bishop returned to c3 for Max to try and get rid of that strong knight on e5. It retreated to g6, and queen h5 manages to tie it down to the defence of the h8 square. Here Akita decided to try queen c6, obviously expecting Max to move the rook on a4. However, what he wasn't expecting was rook takes e7, returning the exchange. Problem here for Akita is that if he takes the rook on a4, queen h6 is going to be a crushing move, obviously threatening checkmate on g7. The pawn on f7 can't move because that uncovers the rook on e7, and really the only way to try and stop the various threats after queen h6 is to play a move like knight e5, in which case Illingworth's happy to exchange on e5 and then play rook takes e5 with rook g5 coming as well. So it's really a very difficult position, but at this stage for Akita, he tried pawn to d5, the rook from e7 went across to a7, pawn to d4 to try and block the diagonal, rook takes d4, queen to b6 hitting the rook but simply doubling on the d-file, queen across to f6, and then simply rook d1 to prevent the check on the back rank, and Max is simply a whole rook up, so Chunta decided to resign.
One of the more interesting games of round 7 was the board 3 clash between Bobby Cheng and Irene Sikandar. The game started off fairly quietly with Bobby employing a Catalan type setup, and Sikandar eventually took the pawn on c4, and after queen c2 played a fairly bold move b5 in both an attempt to hold the c4 pawn and get some pressure on the queen side with those pawns. However, it does open up the long diagonal with the g2 bishop lined up against the a8 rook in the corner. And here Cheng started with a4 to try and undermine that b5 pawn, and Sikandar played b4. And in this position, the vast majority of games that have been played from here featured moving the knight in f3 and opening up that long diagonal, with most games actually beginning with knight f to d2. Then plays followed one of two ways, either following up with c6 to block the diagonal, and then a typical kind of position might follow knight takes c4 and queen takes d4. Or another way that a number of games have gone, instead of after knight d2, knight to d5 to block the diagonal, and then after knight c4 move like knight c6, again putting pressure on the centre. However, Cheng didn't do that. He didn't move the knight, and he instead chose to play bishop to g5. Obviously this is going to be threatening to obviously take the knight on f6 and remove that possibility of playing knight d5. In this position, bishop a6 is actually a fairly common idea, but Sikandar played bishop b7 to block that diagonal. Cheng exchanged on f6, and Sikandar threw in the intermediate move pawn to b3, attacking the queen. After the queen took the pawn on c4, bishop takes the recapture of the bishop on f6, and again this is helping put pressure on the d4 pawn, but Cheng has queen takes b3, gaining a tempo on the bishop on b7. After the bishop moved to d5 and the queen came back to c2, Sikandar continued to develop with knight a6, looking to possibly jump into b4 again with tempo. Cheng grabbed the centre with e4, bishop returned to b7, and Cheng helped support that d pawn with rook d1. Knight jumped into b4, queen came to d2, and then again attacking the centre immediately, pawn to c5, both defending the knight and attacking obviously the d4 pawn, as well as the bishop attacking e4 as well. Pawn to e5, obviously removing the e4 pawn from attack, pressuring the attacking the bishop on f6. So the bishop retreated to e7, and then Cheng simply developed his final minor piece with knight c3. Here Sikandar played queen a5, Cheng played queen e2, rook came to d8, and Cheng took on c5. Here Sikandar chose to recapture with the bishop, and Cheng exchanged rooks on d8, and then began an attack that, at least on the surface, looks a bit speculative, with knight g5. Sikandar captured on g2, and here Cheng could have simply recaptured the bishop with the king and been a pawn to the good, with some pressure from Sikandar, but instead of doing that, he chose to take the game really by the throat and play queen h5, obviously threatening both the h7 and f7 pawns. And we still have obviously the bishop on g2 that Sikandar decided to retreat to c6. Cheng took the pawn on f7, king went to the corner, and then knight takes e6, hitting both the rook on d8 as well as the pawn on g7 with a checkmate threat. So rook g8 stops that, and Cheng centralised his rook on d1. Now there's no real immediate threat, although rook d8 is a little annoying in that Sikandar will probably have to give up the queen for a rook and knight, and then that would leave Cheng with the queen knight and that strong e pawn against those sort of minor pieces and rook of Sikandar. So could have made for an interesting battle there if Sikandar was to make essentially a nothing move and allow rook d8, but obviously the game took a very different course. As you can see here, the suggested best move in the position is actually bishop e8, obviously attacking the queen. Then the queen could return to f3, and Cheng holds at least some initiative for the piece, but Sikandar does have obviously that extra piece. Cheng's got the potential with the e pawn as well as the rook on the open file, so it is still fairly balanced at this stage. However, after rook d1, this is where Sikandar made a fatal blunder and played bishop to b6. This allowed Cheng to play queen to f5. So now there are dual threats, and in particular knight f8 or knight g5. Here Sikandar tried bishop e8, but unfortunately it was one move too late, and after knight f8 she took an f2, and then Cheng calmly just played king to g2, and that's where Sikandar resigned. But it's going to be checkmate very soon. If you try g6, then simply queen f6 check, the rook has to block, and then knight e6 is going to lead to checkmate very shortly. Alternatively, if we go back to the position after queen f5, instead of knight e8 as chosen by Sikandar, bishop takes f2 was another alternative, but then simply king takes knight d5 and knight e2, and Cheng can consolidate his position, and he's also doing fairly well there. So bit of a speculative attack by Cheng, but very nicely finished off, particularly with that knight f8 manoeuvre and the various threats to the king. Looking at some of the other games from round 7, we're going to start with this game between Nick Kadahi and Herman Rachmadi. Starts off as a fairly standard Sicilian knight off, with Kadahi employing a system with bishop c4. After bishop e7, Kadahi plays the aggressive g4, and Rachmadi retreats the knight to d7. This allows a thematic sacrifice on e6, and after taking the pawn on g7, Kadahi actually has 3 pawns now for the bishop.
and somewhat of an exposed king for Rachmati. The knight returns to f5, and Rachmati, rather than trying to develop something with queenside, plays rook e8. Cammeray continues with pawn to g5 to try and get the queen into the action on h5. Rachmati tries king g6 to stop that, but simply knight h4, forcing the king back, and then queen comes into h5. Obviously we're now threatening the rook on e8, so Rachmati moves the rook to g8, but this allows knight f5. Choice of two evils. Obviously Rachmati wants to keep defending his bishop, so he plays king to f8. There's a number of winning alternatives here for Cammeray, but he chooses a simple option, just taking on e7 and then recapturing on h7. Obviously we're attacking both the king and the rook, so the king comes back to f8 to protect the rook, and the follow-up of g6 threatening bishop h6 as well as the queen f7 mate. So rook to g7 to prevent the checkmate, the immediate checkmate. Rook h8 check, the rook again blocks on g8, and then the bishop comes into h6 check. Cammeray takes the free rook. Finally Rachmati decides to develop with knight on c6, and Cammeray simply castles queenside, and Rachmati's king is still in a world of trouble, and he decided that this was enough, being having a rook and 4 pawns down for just a knight. So very nicely played game there by Nick. Moving to our next game. This is a game between Akif Saleh and Lachlan James. If we jump forward to a position 13 moves into the game, James has just played the pawn to a4. Saleh retreats the bishop to c2, and James brings the queen out to a5. This prompts Saleh to start a kingside attack, starting with knight g5, obviously looking to target the h7 pawn. James decides to close the diagonal with pawn to g6, however Saleh takes on h7 anyway. After king takes, it's all downhill, and a fantastic little finish here. Queen h5 check, king g7, queen h6. King goes back to g8. Another piece into the attack with bishop takes g6, f takes, queen takes, king h8, and a very thematic rook left, rook e3. Queen comes back to d8 to try and block the rook check on h4, but after rook h3 and bishop h4 to block the check, a very nice move to finish, bishop g5 to interfere with the defense of the bishop on h4. So next move, the only way to stop simply rook takes h4 is to actually give up the queen on g5. So James decided that that was enough, and a very fine finish there for Akif Saleh. And finally, our last nice little finish that we had for the round, between the game between Mark Chung and Ray Yang. In this position, Yang just played rook h8, and Chung captures on a6. Yang recaptures, and Chung plays knight b4. Here Yang probably needs to find a move like queen b5, which might be able to hold. Possibly something like queen b5 and rook h7 or something like that may hold, albeit that his position isn't particularly good at the moment with the open files in front of the king, and Yang's king is obviously in far more danger than Chung's is. However, Yang played queen to d7, knight took the pawn on a6, and Yang brought the king up to b7. Queen b3 check, so obviously the knight's immune because of rook a1, so he blocked with the bishop. And a very nice little maneuver here, knight c5 check, obviously forking king and queen, exploiting that pinned bishop on b6. So Yang tries king c6. Very nice maneuvering here by Chung. He decides to take one of the key defenders, the bishop on e4 first, and this means that Yang only is able to go back to b7, so employs something of a little windmill here to potentially win the queen. However, rather than winning the queen, he plays rook a1, threatening obviously mate on a8. Here, king b8 is really the only defense, and then simply knight takes the queen on d7. However, Yang tries queen c6, and a very nice little tactic to finish off. Queen e6 check, nice little deflection. Obviously, if you block with the rook or play king b8, simply queen takes queen on c6, and after queen takes e6, then rook to a8 mate. Very nice finish there for Mark Chung, and that's going to wrap up our coverage or review of round 7. Of course, if you're unable to make it to the venue, the best place to follow the tournament is on the website. You can see the address listed there. It's a Google site. The easiest way to get there is following the links from the North Chess Club page. The main link there is northcitychess.org. That's got all the information you need about the tournament in terms of the draw, the pairings, results, games, etc. Or you can follow some of the updates on my blog, melbournegamescoach.blogspot.com. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you for the next video.